use them to embed whole school teaching and learning priorities and policies as well. So for us, that's oracy in the classroom. And finally, as I say, as a subject leader of a department of around 6 or 7, I think it can also be used as a great developmental and collaborative opportunity. So I've asked 2 of my team this year to redesign inquiries in year 8. And we've spent our recent department meeting sort of meeting and constructively critiquing what those booklets look like and thinking about how we might tweak things. Do they need a radical overhaul for next year, perhaps? Simultaneously, I mentioned earlier that I was concerned about how GCSE students at my previous school were sometimes quite passive and that they were quite compliant note takers, but not always doing the hard thinking. So as a relatively new A-level politics teacher, this is something that frustrated me last year in particular, my first year teaching the course. We spent a lot of time reading and note taking from quite a dense textbook, and then had little time to read, discuss and check for understanding, which often meant that I wasn't always clear on whether they got on those key knowledge takeaways. So when I began my first teaching of political ideas, paper 3 this year, I created 2 workbooks, one for socialism, one for liberalism. And once again, they help to support the all-in-one place principle that I'm quite fond of. But again, I wanted the focus here to be on not taking the notes, but using them. So a much more of an emphasis on the reading and the discussion and the summary rather than trying to get everything down, which could often be quite time consuming. And my lessons genuinely felt much more dialogic. There was much greater back and forth. I felt like the students got it, and I knew that I could then ask them to go home, consolidate, or do the note taking in their own time as well. So the design, like in my A-level history ones from what you saw earlier, allow me to really support core A-level study skills as well. I want them to really focus on independent revision and further reading and more. Now, as I come towards the end of my talk, I just want to share one more format that I think students at my school have benefited from. So looks like a workbook, or looks like a booklet, I should say, but it's actually in digital form. So with the possibility of GCSE reform on the horizon over the next few years, I'm quite reluctant to introduce workbooks for a specification that's now around 10 years old. But I did spot recently that some teachers were using Microsoft SharePoint as a place to share resources with students. So over the last year or 2, I've been creating something called our catch-up and revision hub, we call it. We've got one for Key Stage 4 and one for Key Stage 5. And really, they kind of act as one-stop shops for everything that they need to support their revision. So they will use this predominantly prior to mock exams and the real exams, but also if they've need to catch up on missed work, if they've been absent, or if they are doing revision prior to an assessment as well. So rather than an in-class booklet or workbook, essentially this is a digital resource and they can access through their Microsoft account. And I imagine something could be done via Google as well if this was a principle that you're interested in, and that's what your school uses. But as I say, it contains everything they need to support their studies. And I feel as a history teacher, this is quite important because there's so much out there. But some of that stuff is now out of date. Some of it isn't always, in my view, high quality. And so being able to quality assure that and make sure that I direct them towards what I want them to focus on, I think is quite important as well. So I've got content summaries, links to online resources like GCSE Pod, exam technique guides, past paper questions and more. So for example, like I've got content summaries like this, just keeping it to really core knowledge that they need without being too overwhelming. And things like this on the right, where we've outlined the specification, but also links to websites they might go to that they might find helpful to support their revision, because we know some students do like to use those online resources as well. So I've focused much of my talk this evening on sort of the overall purpose and the format of these documents. But a conversation with a colleague the other week reminded me about design choices of mine. I think I probably took for granted because it's not something I immediately spoke about when we were talking about how I do workbooks and booklets. So I think if you do go down the route of designing workbooks or booklets, it's worth bearing in mind that some of the principles of cognitive science have become more embedded in our work as educators in the last few years, like cognitive load theory and dual coding. So for example, I'm quite careful to limit the amount of text on a page, particularly for a text-based source or a bit of challenging reading. Now, this might seem pretty obvious to most of us, but I imagine there probably are still teachers out there who will throw a massive chunk of text onto a page in size 10 in maybe a font that isn't always particularly friendly for some of our students with special educational needs. And equally, the power of images to illustrate what we're talking about is sometimes missed. So, I was teaching a lesson on changes in the USSR under Stalin. And we were doing a bit of reading on that, and looking in particular at the cult of personality. And what was missing from that particular sheet in that instance was, I just think, a picture of a portrait of Stalin that was being held aloft on the streets of Moscow or one of the other Russian cities. Could have been quite powerful, just illustrating what that looked like. So overall, though, I would urge colleagues to see booklets or workbooks as a means by which you can not only choose which information and knowledge you want to share with students, but also a means by which you can choose how it's best presented as well. So if this is something that interests you, you know, if like me back in 2020, you're intrigued by this as a possibility for your department, you might be thinking, well, where do I go next? So I suppose after a number of years of doing this now, my advice, as with anything you might implement in your department, is to consider your own context. What are the needs of your students in your school? What kind of department do you have? How willing are you to take on this labor of love? You know, for example, when I was a head of history with a vice principal in my team and a trainee, I wasn't really able to delegate as much, and so design mainly fell to me. That's obviously quite a time-consuming thing. But luckily, at the time, I was quite driven. I didn't have many extra commitments, so I was happy to kind of put that extra work in. But equally, in the first 2 or 3 years of my current school, even with a bigger team, I felt I had to lead the way and set the standard of what I wanted in that context. But now I'm in a position where I think I can delegate to other colleagues as well. And that's taken some of the load off, which I think is always a good position to be in. And again, if you're a middle leader, see this perhaps as a developmental opportunity for your team, you know, helping them to plan a scheme of work as well. And I think you'll also want to consider whether an intense revolutionary approach is possible. I think Caitlin referenced earlier on, you know, the possibilities or the pitfalls of trying to be revolutionary and kind of completely overhauling, say, Key Stage 3. But it might be that in your context, you need to be more gradualist. So either way, to bring your team with you, you'll need to be clear on the why. You know, what problems will booklets or workbooks, whatever format you choose, actually help to solve? What barriers might there be to implementation? So sort of as I just come to an end here, I'll just leave this slide on the board for you to have a little look through. So this is from an article called Putting Evidence to Work by the EEF. There's a fantastic article that I used to support some training I was doing last year. And it's really all about sort of how leaders can implement change in departments or across schools. And I think just thinking about some of these things here is a great way to think about any implementation of any change. But something like booklets, I think, you know, this would help you to think about how you might implement that too. Anyway, whatever you decide to do, I hope this talk has given you some ideas about why bookletizing your history curriculum might be an approach worth exploring and the various formats these resources can take. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I took loads away from that. So I inherited booklets this year for Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. And actually, in terms of Key Stage 5, it's been so helpful as I've been learning the A-levels. So actually to be able to pick something up and the notes to be there, even for me, and then to be able to send them away, and us both to get our head around, all of us to get our head around it and come back and discuss, has been so much better than them sitting and just making lots and lots of notes in lesson. And it is now something that I need to completely review, because we've kind of been picking them up and use it, trying to adapt ones that existed before, but for a new IGCSE course. So my summer work is definitely to I've got all these ones that have got stuff written all over them to change now. But brilliant. Thank you so much for that.
My
it was
pleasure.
so useful.
Thank you.
I think everyone can take a lot away from that. I think there's a lot of us who now make our own bespoke worksheets and things. So actually, if we can put those all together, whether you're making kind of your own textbook or a workbook, whether you're going to do a revolutionary and evolutionary approach. I'm also a massive fan of that name check there of the EEF implementation guide. Anything that helps us to actually organise our time is fantastic. So once again, Ross, thank you very much. I'm going to move speedily on now to Jack Brown, who is a history teacher and curriculum planner with a keen interest in local history in particular. Jack's going to share how we can link gained time to deepening local context, and is very kindly joining us from halfway across the world. So thank you so much, and I will let you get on with it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi there. My name's Jack. I'm the head of history here at the British School of Tokyo. Yeah, it's quite an early start to the morning, but I got tomorrow off, so that's all right. Today, I'm going to speak to you about how to meaningfully and holistically diversify and decolonize local history with a particular focus on the Key Stage 3. I will be using examples from Southeast London, although I am in Greenwich. Actually, how do I change the slide here? Oh, there we go. And really, this journey kind of began slightly before 2020, but I think 2020 was a real turning point for me, as it was for a lot of history educators. Because of the events that you can see in front of you, a lot of history educators were forced to reflect about the diverse and inclusive natures of their curriculum. We were also forced to reflect on whether we were accurately teaching Britain's role and connection to transatlantic enslavement and the impact of British colonialism. But as you can see on the screen in front of you, events like the toppling of Colston's statue and the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, history educators were also forced to think about whether we were meaningfully teaching the local legacies of transatlantic enslavement and the British Empire, and how these legacies are effectively in the fabric of our local communities, whether it be statues, in museums, in schools, or even in street names. So for me and my department at the time, we actually went away and did quite a lot of thinking. And we wanted to kind of think of how we could actually do justice to this. Because the demands for change were not coming from history educators, and they were not coming from history professors. The demands for change were actually coming from the younger generation. It was coming from our pupils and our ex-pupils. So whether we liked it or not, the students in our classroom were discussing and debating about effectively the local heritage and the local connections between Britain and transatlantic enslavement. So let's see if I can do the next slide. Yeah, so we were greatly influenced by a book called Teaching History for the Common Good and the work from Justice to History, an education consultancy company in London. Now, Justice to History wrote an article called The Anatomy of Historical Inquiries, and we decided to kind of apply their thinking and try and do our own anatomy of how we would approach local history and how we would approach and embed local history throughout the curriculum. We actually came up with 5 different approaches, we came up with 5 different approaches. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them today. And really, this idea of local history being a microcosm for our local, national, and global story, but also how local history can act as a mirror. And it can act as a mirror which forces us to engage in this kind of process of reflection. And this usually arises from dealing with more difficult, more challenging, and more controversial history. So looking at basically the local legacies of transatlantic enslavement and the British Empire. So when we look at our history curriculum, I think it's fair to say that most history teachers do teach some kind of local history in their curriculum. However, I think there's a danger that a lot of that local history can predominantly reflect people who look like me. Local history has predominantly been white, male, and like a Eurocentric kind of story. And I think this has the potential or danger of marginalizing and disempowering many of our students who have diverse backgrounds. So students who are from diverse backgrounds, if they can see themselves in the curriculum, if they can identify with the curriculum, then they're going to be able to be more empowered and be able to actually engage with that curriculum much more. Now, I would argue that students and even ourselves have an incredibly strong connection or stronger connection to local history. It's the history that we live and breathe. We go to school, we go to the high street, we work in our local communities. So if we're able to diversify our local history, then perhaps there is, an advantage that we can actually not just empower students to be able to identify and see themselves in the curriculum, but also to identify and see themselves in the local community. And I think one way we can do this is by teaching a local history of migration through time, with a particular focus on a site or a street. And I think the advantage of doing this is it gives students a physical, tangible place for them to engage with the second order concepts of change and continuity, but it's also something that resonates with them a lot more. And again, it gives them a physical place to engage with the substantive concepts of migration and diversity. But perhaps more importantly, what we're doing is we're challenging this notion of Britishness being an exclusive, narrow vision of, and being synonymous with whiteness, okay? By teaching the migration of Britain, the history of migration to Britain, we're challenging this land of hope and glory narrative, this idea that, you know, Britishness is exclusive. And, you know, this is not a kind of like liberal conspiracy. There were African Romans who were living in York. There were Black Tudors who were living in the port cities of England at the time. So diverse histories is there. It's just been marginalized, or it's just been hidden by the main white colonial narrative. So we were greatly inspired by another article that basically used a street through time. Now, if you wanted to do this, you could obviously use a street. We actually decided to use Greenwich Park. The reason why we chose to use Greenwich Park was because it is just full of layers and layers and layers of history. And it is a fantastic, fantastic site to use. So Greenwich Park has a Roman ruins of a temple. It has an Anglo-Saxon burial ground. It also has African Tudors, African Georgians living around that were living in and around the park as well. The cafe at the top of Greenwich Park is now been renamed after Ignatius Sancho, who was an African Georgian. You've also got the observatory and the even the Cutty Sark tea clipper down the road. So for us, this was like a perfect opportunity to effectively create a really fantastic inquiry about the migration of people through time. And what we actually got the students to do at the end of the inquiry, as the inquiry assessment, was to create a kind of timeline of the people who have migrated to Greenwich through time. And on each leaf of this timeline, we used a tree, and each leaf of the tree, they had to color code and explain the individual, the group, the context, and how this was a change or a continuity. And we quite like the idea of getting them to color code their leaves, because then it could actually see just how beautiful and just how rich and just how diverse their local community was. And I think we decided to do a kind of family history as well, a family timeline, which I think has been part of the history curriculum for a while now. So we wanted to try and see if kids could actually kind of like link the two, perhaps. And even if they couldn't, and if they were part of a family who was first, second, or even third generation of migrants to Greenwich, they could actually be empowered by the fact that their family is just part of a bigger story of migration. So even though, you know, perhaps that there wasn't that longevity in the local community, they could still see, well, actually, this is just I'm just part of this big story of migration. And I think that for us was really quite a powerful thing. We decided to teach this inquiry at the start of our Year 7 curriculum because we felt it was quite a poignant message to share with the students and really kind of like show the Year 7 students who and what we were about as a department. However, you can also put this at the end of the Year 7 curriculum. I think it's a really nice way of pulling together previously taught inquiries. And I mean, arguably, you know, there's advantages and limitations to both approaches, but the advantage of having it at the end of the year, the students might have a bit more historical background context of each of the different groups. So, you know, if you study the Normans, actually change the way you teach the Normans in terms of in focusing more about migration. So when you come to look at the migration of people through time at the end of the Year 7 curriculum, actually it ties in with your sequencing and your kind of cohesion and coherency of that year. We did focus the inquiry around change and continuity, but after 2020, it became much more focused around how historians use evidence and how historians use different artifacts and different sources as evidence. So the inquiry question changed around how do historians use evidence to uncover the diversity of Greenwich through time. We actually really like this because they weren't just seeing how, patterns of migration, but they were also seeing, doing the work of historians and actually seeing, different periods of history, you're going to need to use different types of artifacts. So I think both approaches are really nice. Both inquiry questions are really nice. But I think for us, having a slight second order focus on the evidence rather than just the change in continuity, I think was a nice way of just getting the kids excited about sources. And obviously, any good history trip, regardless of if it's a local trip or, an international trip, teaching the history before and after, I think is a really powerful way of getting the students to be familiar and be able to identify with the history that they're being taught on the day. How much time do I have, Emily? Okay. I'm just going to say the last thing really was in year 8, we did an inquiry that looked at the local legacies of transatlantic enslavement. We use a number of sites around London, looking at the London Docklands, looking at Bank. We also look at Greenwich, more cultural sites and like museums. There's a lot more I'd like to say about this inquiry, but I don't have time today. We get the students to design a walking tour for looking at basically how, London's connections to empire and slavery, and they have to link it back to previously taught inquiries. So we felt this was a really powerful way of identifying the connections between the British Empire, the Industrial Revolution, and transatlantic enslavement. And having this mini inquiry at the end of year 8 shows that these were not separate and distinct histories, but actually they're all intertwined. And I think for us as well, it removed that othering of the past, that these atrocities were actually committed at a different time, a different place by different people. And therefore, I shouldn't have to be associated or shouldn't have to be concerned with them. And we found that giving the students the autonomy to create their own walking tour as the outcome activity of this inquiry really got them quite riled up in the best possible way. And I think they found it really enjoyable. So yeah, I'd love to talk more about that inquiry and some of the other inquiries we do. We did an inquiry on the suffragettes and the role of women in Woolwich Arsenal as well, which was a really neat inquiry for the year 9s. So yeah, just a few tips and tricks, but definitely do the history of migration in Key Stage 3. Cheers.
That was brilliant, Jack. Thank you so much. You getting up early is so useful because honestly, even I'm looking at it and going, okay, right, so I've got a local history unit at the beginning of year 7 and I want to take them out to look at to go and do that local trip to get them there. But actually that identifying connections that they can see that history has actually happened where they are and just breaking down that otherness of it. There is honestly so much that I have taken away from that. And I really like the idea of lenses. So you're not just teaching the Norman conquest, you're flipping that lens and just looking at it from a different perspective. I think it's such a powerful thing. And I think that's one of the things in terms of gained time that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look at units we already have. And like you said, that diverse history is there. we just need to refocus and put the lens on it instead of that Eurocentric aspect. But thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure if anybody wants to ask Jack any questions or get in touch with him, his socials are all over ours as well. So please do get in touch with him and find out more about the amazing work that Jack is doing. Thank you so much, Jack. So we are going to move swiftly on. Benji is going to talk to us now. So he is Benji Groom. He is going to help us zoom out and think big picture thinking. He's going to focus on curriculum sequencing, how to use the end of year space to plan coherently across that long term. Anything that can make our next year smoother and stronger is, I'm sure, going to be very welcomed. So over to you, Benji. Just need to unmute.
Oh dear. Hopefully everyone can see the slideshow now. Is that showing up for everyone, Emily? Bro, super. Right, let's do take two. Hi everyone, I'm Benji Groom. I'm the subject lead for history at the Oak National Academy. So you may have heard of us from the pandemic resources that we produced. But we're very much a curriculum body by and for teachers now that provide a range of sort of teaching resources and full curricula really in lots of different subjects, including history. So I thought today, I mean, the other presenters have just like absolutely smashed it out of the park with some amazing like deep dives, overused phrase, into some things you can do in game time, whereas I think what I'm going to try and do is maybe probably like copy a few of those ideas, because there's definitely some parallels and some overlap, and talk about maybe in a practical sense what you might want to do if you're just absolutely swamped. No, you can't get everything done, but you also know that what you want to do something meaningful that's not going to disrupt your curriculum through sort of a good intention gone wrong. So I've kind of taken a few principles that we used when we planned and resourced our history curriculum to suggest some things that you could maybe think about. So let's get this moving on. We're going to talk about the problem and then some of the solutions. So I think there's a problem sometimes with how you can use game time. Like I've seen this in my time as a head of department at the end of the year, thinking there's a unit I just absolutely hate. I want to change that inquiry up completely. And often, that's what we end up doing. We invest all our time in the couple of weeks that we get where we've got more time to try and improve that one inquiry, say, or a couple of inquiries or a couple of lessons. And as we know, our time gets taken away, it gets interrupted with other things. It's never really as fully sort of protected as we want. And so we get some problems sometimes from our attempts to make curricular improvement during game time. So I've outlined them there. Sometimes we have so many incremental sort of piecemeal improvements in our curriculum that becomes a bit of a sort of ship of Theseus or Trigger's broom situation where we know all the different bits have been replaced at different times, but do they sort of knit together? Maybe we get a loss of coherence as a result because we improve things with a real focus on one area, but maybe it's a bit short-sighted. And sometimes that can, create pupil confusion. There's so much talk now, isn't there, of curriculum as narrative, curriculum as a progression model. We don't really think about the coherence in our curriculum when we're making changes at this time. We can get a lot of pupil confusion. It puts us in a tricky place for external scrutiny from senior leaders, from our own colleagues, etc. So maybe those are some of the problems if we go in wholeheartedly to make some improvements, but maybe we don't have the sort of like quite the time we want, or we haven't had enough time to do it exactly how we do want. So maybe there are a few solutions that I've sort of thought about, that we thought about when we designed our curriculum to think about coherence. And that's really anchoring things around sort of places, people, second order concepts, and substantive concepts, which, you know, none of these are new ideas at all. Obviously, the second order and substantive concepts. But I feel that if you know you are stuck for time when it comes to game time, you know it's going to be tricky to overhaul 1 unit, 2 units, etc. Actually looking at how you can use these techniques, these small adjustments with these focuses, they can have sort of like exponentially more powerful results than replanning an entire unit or a set of lessons, because they're results that can manifest themselves across the curriculum. So essentially, you know, one would hope from this you get stronger curricular outcomes, got a clearer spine to your curriculum because there are more unifying factors, the increased coherence that comes from that makes more sense for pupils, that narrative element, that clarity about what's being learned, when and why comes out. And that clarity is also there for external parties or skeptics within your team or school. So one thing you can do is to look at places. So, you know, particularly just, you know, what we've heard there about like local history is, you know, this is an area you can absolutely dive into on this. I sort of thought that, you know, places and rich description of places, if you think carefully about the places, the cities, the towns, the particular locations where those already exist in your curriculum, and think about ones that could also be included, and include them, you know, in a number of different ways. So, you know, places that are visited across multiple inquiries. So, for example, Baghdad, somewhere pupils may be familiar with from studying Islamic civilization at the end of or at some point in primary school. Maybe not all pupils studied that, as it's not compulsory, and so actually in your year 7 you begin in that sort of that sphere, which is actually, you know, pre-1066 really, but you look at, you know, Baghdad or Cordoba or somewhere like that, and then the ability to visit that again and again with the, you know, the attack of the Mongols. Constantinople is really right for this. I've just been listening to this brilliant HA webinar series from the folks at ArcZone, where they talk about how Constantinople features in 2 of their year 7 inquiries, and it provides that real, natural, authentic, historical check for understanding, check for knowledge, when you can actually take pupils back to a place that they have already visited, now advanced forward in history. Using places that can sort of build bridges or connections. You might have inquiries that seem sort of like disparate or separated, or very, very, you know, jarring, the difference between them. Maybe a place can be positioned as a story to link to inquiries, you know, just for a lesson, or having a shared place that can be referred to in 2 inquiries, that, you know, can help with that sense of connection, help with that sense of the big story for pupils. Just using really rich descriptions of places to build a sense of period, you know, thinking about all this discussion that we have about, you know, core and hinterland knowledge, the role of the hinterland there, you know, descriptions of bustling marketplaces, you know, the streets of Renaissance Florence, like it doesn't get any better than that really in terms of building that occidental hinterland detail for pupils. And then also, you know, making very, very transparent and clear choices about, we want to pick places that occur in our curriculum at multiple points to show the connected world at a particular time. So really focusing on cities or towns or places of trade, you know, trade nexuses, routes, places where ideas were communicated and traveled through, and being really deliberate about that. So we can put places into our curriculum, or take them from where they already are and maybe think how they could go into other parts of our curriculum to sort of help with that coherence. We can do the same with people. So you can share people and their stories, just like places, and share them between the inquiries, you know, as is often discussed, the psychologically privileged role of story and memory, having the story of someone who travels to multiple places, or whose story overlaps in multiple areas. You know, Caitlin was talking earlier about different aspects of suffrage and sort of like almost decolonizing suffrage in a way. You know, there's a huge overlap in that late Victorian, early Edwardian period of different sort of pressure groups and political activities that are just, you know, absolutely ripe for that, with all these interesting characters and their stories. The idea as well that, you know, you might reference people in other inquiries. So, you know, Alexander the Great, when it comes to discussing his legacy in terms of, you know, Alexandria, the way other people saw him and have remembered him. So bringing in that aspect of interpretations in a sort of light touch way. In our curriculum, you know, Napoleon overlaps quite a few of our inquiries, our inquiry on Haiti and British reactions to the French Revolutionary period. Others, you know, the mathematician Euclid is mentioned in a primary context, and then through to the secondary as well in the Renaissance, with that all through context. So, you know, people and their stories, they can bridge gaps between inquiries. You can also retrofit them, and I think that one in yellow is really key. Like, if you have a problem or trickiness with balancing overview and depth, or depth and breadth, which is one of those things in the national curriculum and in all our teaching history articles and all this sort of thing that we read, people throw it out there, but it's so challenging to get right across an entire curriculum. If you know you have an inquiry where it's great on the overview, it's great on the breadth, on the big national picture, but it's just missing that something. Maybe what it's missing is that individual story, that really rich individual narrative of one person that can give a real human, tangible framework to the bigger picture. So I'd encourage thinking about that. That's something you can look at. And then I'm sure we're all familiar with sort of second order or disciplinary and substantive concepts. But I think one big part of using game time effectively is that like constant audit and monitoring of the balance and interplay of second order and substantive concepts across the entire curriculum, so that we ensure that any changes are adding to the overall selection and blend of experiences rather than making them lopsided or one note. So thinking about these questions can prove really useful. You know, if we think about our second order concepts, you know, have we got enough variety across the curriculum? Is a particular year causation heavy? Is the whole Key Stage 3 curriculum too focused on change and continuity? Are my inquiry questions worded tightly enough? You know, thinking about Ross's session on booklets there, these are the sorts of things where, you know, you can look at pupil work and you can think, well, they didn't really get to the nub of the rate of change in that inquiry. So I need to look at that inquiry question and rephrase it to really focus on that and make it more deliberate. Is, you know, the diet within a second order concept rich and varied? You know, incremental and compounding, cumulative in what it's doing for people's understanding. You know, when it comes to causation, are they always giving social, economic and political causes? Well, historians don't do that, do they? You know, if we show them multiple good models of how academic historians write about causation, that will give them a rich and varied diet. And if each of those examples is then authentic to the particular debate into which those historians are entering historiographically, then we are giving them a really rich and varied diet across the second order concept, rather than just doing the same thing again and again in a way that keeps our senior leaders happy, because we can put them on a silly flight path in terms of they're getting better at causation because they were able to list causes. Now they can put them into different boxes. You know, we all know it's rubbish. Sometimes we have to fight against it, and it's quite tricky, that sort of reductive assessment practice. But our curriculum can do that for us. Like, it can do a lot. And then I think with substantive concepts, we think, you know, how do they appear? Where do they appear? Are they repeatedly encountered? The ones that we really want to make a big song and dance about, how they reinforced, how they made richer. You know, are there key substantive concepts that you think actually you want across your curriculum, and then they actually wither out, you know, and they're not there in year 9. So why is that? Is that natural because of these things changing over the course of history? You know, in year 9, you might have less of a focus on the idea of monarchy or something like that. So it makes sense for it to sort of wither out. But also, where do big substantive concepts enter your curriculum? And it's like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? Because if I'm thinking empire suddenly comes in year 9 with the British Empire, and it's only had a cursory mention in some of those formative moments of year 7 and year 8, where I could have looked at sort of empires in that 11th century period, and how they looked across the Mediterranean, maybe in medieval West Africa, for example, like Caitlin was talking about, or in year 8, how that then looks in terms of like early empires and how they were viewed from like European empires in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, and how those differed then from the British or the Second British Empire, for example. If empire just comes in year 9, like, we've got a problem, right? Pupils will only understand empire on a one-note British Empire perspective, which is fine. They might know a lot about the British Empire, but their understanding of the substantive concept of empire is not going to be particularly rich and multi-layered. So thinking about that, and then just also like thinking in your curriculum in terms of how it is enacted, how it's implemented in the classroom. If you've got key substantive concepts, are they really, really, really clearly front-loaded for your pupils? Like in the narratives that you write, the text that you produce or choose, in the vocabulary lists that you use, in your quizzing, in your recall, in your questioning, in your more formative, longer pieces of work, are you always making a really big deal of those substantive concepts? Like, oh, that's interesting, year 7. 2 terms ago, we were talking about the Byzantine Empire. Right, let's quickly remember what that empire looked like, X, Y, Z. But now we're looking at the Ottoman Empire. So this is the example of what ArcZone was showing. What's similar? What's different? Really sort of like front-loading those moments and planning purposefully for those moments to exist. So thanks for listening. Hope that's useful / helpful. Big picture. And do feel free to get in touch at any time. My email's on there. Take a look at what we've been doing at Oak National. And thanks a lot for your patience and forbearance.
No, thank you so much. And I think it's a really good thing because it can feel almost overwhelming at times. So to actually look at one element and say, actually, what I want to do is to make sure that this place or this person comes up again, like this, whether it's a trader or all of these things, it feels doable in a small amount of time, and yet you still feel like you're tinkering and you're moving that curriculum forward, which I think is what we're all essentially aiming to do at this time of year, is try to think about how can we make things better. And so I think that's a really valuable way of doing it. So thank you so much for your time. And as you said, you can go and find Benji's resources on Oak and in his own socials. So we're going to move very swiftly on to Sam Slater. I was super excited that Sam Slater was going to come and speak to us today. She appears on Facebook all the time, and I think she's a bit of a teaching history legend. So I was very excited that she agreed to come and speak to us today, and particularly about revision, which is such a tricky thing to get right. I've been trying to embed. I feel like I'm banging this drum all the time of we don't just revise just beforehand, and then every time we get the same things. So please give me some solutions. So over to you, Sam.
Hi, Emily. Thank you. Wow, that was an introduction. Yes. So yeah, I'm Sam Slater, and I am a head of history at a school in Kent. If anybody knows the education system in Kent, we do face some challenges with a grammar school system, and I don't teach in a grammar school. So revision certainly is something that I've had to think really carefully about for the students that I teach. Alongside being a head of history, I do also work as an EdXL GCSE specialist advisor. So I guess it's no surprise this evening that I am going to approach a presentation with a GCSE kind of revision way of thinking. And my slides haven't come out great. I do actually do this quite a lot, but it doesn't look like exactly where I've placed my images is going to work for you guys. But hopefully you can still see what I'm presenting. Just like Emily said, I think we as teachers, when we are trying to prepare our Key Stage 4 students for their final summative GCSE exams, we face huge challenges. So really what I want us to do kind of as we begin this presentation is think about what are the challenges that students face when they are revising for their GCSE history. And I collected some ideas together. I've been at my school now for 2 years, and pretty much immediately what I noticed, what I kind of picked up from the students that I teach, is that my students, they want to do well, they want to achieve, they want to arrive on results day, open their envelopes, be proud of themselves, make their parents proud, make me proud. But there's a lot of challenges and a lot of, I guess, obstacles for them to overcome to be able to do that. And, the most obvious obstacle was they just don't know how. They don't know how to revise. And I think sometimes as teachers, we've been through exams ourselves. We've been through university. We've had to revise. And I think we probably take it a bit for granted that we know how to do it. And when we're saying to students, revise this, learn this, revise for this assessment, you must do some revision tonight, I think we kind of take it a bit for granted that, the students are going to know what that means, what that actually looks like. For some of them, as I say, they don't know how, they don't know where to start. And certainly, I think a key challenge for GCSE is that there is just so much to revise. Talking to students, talking to colleagues, talking to people that I work with in a number of different environments, history alongside subjects like science, very content based, very content heavy. And so they get to the end of Key Stage 4, they've got, X numbers of exercise books, can be like 6 exercise books in some cases. They kind of look at it, it's intimidating, they don't know where to start. And so then leads the kind of the avoidance tactics. Oh, I'll do it tomorrow. I don't know what to do. I'll come back to that. I'll read through my book. And we all know that some of those approaches to revision just, aren't successful, aren't effective. And like I say, what we don't want to do, I think, is leave revision and leave students' confidence in revision to year 10, or even worse, to year 11. I don't think we should be suddenly in year 11 just expecting our students to know how to revise. I think it's something that we really need to be teaching from the beginning of Key Stage 3. So this is kind of what I wanted to share with you this evening, and to share with you kind of the approach that I've implemented in my department, and show you some examples and give you some feedback from my students. What we have spent a long time doing, a long time is probably a bit of an exaggeration, but we've spent some of our gained time and some time throughout the year thinking about where in our curriculum we can actually teach students how to revise. So planning lessons that are focused on teaching revision strategies and how to revise. So to start with, what I advise actually is that you decide on a revision method that you want to teach. You don't overcomplicate it with, here are 5 different ways you can revise. You just pick one revision method, and you teach this through Key Stage 3 and through Key Stage 4. The method that I've chosen in my school is our revision placemats, for a number of reasons. One, because they can be quite easily created, as you'll see, and easily, printed and shared with the students. They can be shared via Teams. I love that, students are accessing resources electronically. And when I hear these presentations, I think it's fantastic. Unfortunately, my students aren't. When I set homework on Carousel or on Teams, it doesn't get done. When I set a worksheet, it's done. So that's kind of, I've kind of picked up what my students enjoy, what my students buy into. And we use placemats. And as I say, you'll see some examples shortly. And we teach students how to use these revision placemats throughout Key Stage 3 for the built-in Key Stage 3 assessments. And then at Key Stage 4, we start to build in flashcards and how to use the placemats to create flashcards. And the reason for that is that my school in year 11, they have a whole school strategy. Every subject area is asked to teach students how to use flashcards to revise. We have form groups that are, kind of intervention focused. And so again, through those form groups activities, students are using flashcards. So I wanted to ensure through history, the history department, that the revision we are teaching our students, the revision method that we're teaching our students in Key Stage 4 can build into supporting them with the flashcards and the whole school strategy later on. And as I say, we looked at our Key Stage 3 curriculum and we built in time for teaching students how to revise. This was very much before an assessment. That could be knowledge questions, a knowledge question assessment. We have a number of assessments kind of termly, really, that kind of assess how students at Key Stage 3 assess their understanding for the inquiry questions, and they pretty much happen like once per half term. So within that, we build in either a lesson or part of a lesson where we are teaching students how to revise before an assessment or before an extended piece of writing. And what does that look like? So what does a lesson look like? If we were taking a lesson and looking at, how are we actually teaching revision? This is kind of the approach that we use. We always start by using a circle map, and we encourage students to recall what they can remember about a given topic. So begin the lesson with, the two circles, the circle map. I'm happy to share kind of a standard template for this, but I'm pretty sure you can get it quicker on Google. And then what we do through, they work on that independently. And then as a whole class, they then add extra information using a different color pen as whole class feedback discussion. Then using that circle map and using their books, the students complete the placemat in a lesson. And as I say, you'll see an example shortly. And then what we do, we give them the time to work in groups to complete their placemat, to find the information. Because again, what I want students realizing is that thinking, that doing is what's going to help them remember, rather than just reading through a book or watching a YouTube clip. Some of my Key Stage 4 kids love all the YouTube resources that are available now, but they're not doing anything they weren't doing anything when they were watching them. And then we always take time at the end of that lesson to model for students how they can use the resources outside of the classroom. I have a significant number of students who don't have that support at home, who don't have the home environment where someone is going to sit down and revise with them. So we take time in the lesson to kind of model testing. Okay, now use your placemat to test your friends, work as a group, as pairs, test each other. Who can get the most questions right? What we're trying to do through that is to teach the students that it's not just about completing the placemat or completing the flashcard, but how they use that resource, and to teach them, this is how you can use that resource when you're at home. So here we've got some examples of some Key Stage 3 placemats. So we've just taken out our Term 1 and our Term 2 schemes of work and inquiries. This builds up to we have a Term 2 big assessment, and then we have a Term 6 cumulative assessment. And using the placemats, we make sure that on the placemat is the information that they need for the assessment. So we ensure that any of the questions or the extended writing or the source analysis in the assessment is covered in the placemat. We want to teach the students that there is a reward for doing this activity, that it will make it easier for them when they complete the assessment. You can see here another one coming from the Year 9 Term 5 assessment revision sheet. So we're breaking it down, and they're using the information from their lessons to create, I guess you could say, a knowledge organizer. We're not giving them the knowledge. They are finding the information and creating their own knowledge organizer. It's just that in our department, we call it a placemat. We can see here some photos of ones that one of my students has completed. So you can kind of see the outcome. We start it in the lesson. We give them then the opportunity to complete this at home. And then here you can see the outcome in terms of the impact of this activity when they're completing the knowledge questions in their assessment. And we had some really positive feedback from parents at Parents' Evening as well, that students really enjoy this. It's structured. They feel there's a benefit. It also, we had positive feedback from parents because they were saying, we don't know how to help our sons and daughters revise. We don't know what they should be doing. And so this is really helpful because we can just kind of oversee them. And then once the placemat is completed, we can help them with the testing, which again is what we kind of told the students in the lesson to do. Test each other, get your brothers, your parents, your grandparents to test you. So what we do is we do this throughout Key Stage 3, and our goal is that hopefully by the time they enter the GCSE years, by the time they arrive in year 10, they're confident with how to revise. They know how to complete a placemat, they know how to use it, they know how to revise, so that when we get to year 10, there's very little teaching. And my current year 10s are the first year group where this is really kind of having a positive impact. I don't need to have the lessons anymore of how to complete the placemat and what to do with it at home, because they know how to do this from their year 9 lessons. I think we all know the struggle that we have at Key Stage 4 in getting through the content and teaching the content, and I totally hear you. So finding lessons for revision then can be quite a struggle. But if students are confident in the approach, they know what to do from the time you've spent at Key Stage 3, hopefully it'll be easier in the long run. And here we've got some examples of the Key Stage 4 revision placemats that I've created, and I've just used the spec. I've used the exam spec and the focus on the exam spec, and I've created placemats around the spec. And what's really lovely is that for Elizabeth, this is the Early Elizabethan England and British Depth Study unit that we do. And the way I've created the placemats is that the whole unit is then summarised onto 3 A3 sheets of paper. And you can see here that they're divided by the key topics. But also what I was really impressed with the one on the right-hand side is that this I believe this really shows the confidence that the students become, how confident they become in revision and their independence. Because I didn't tell them to create a key and to highlight their notes. They've gone ahead and done that on their own, which, I think was fantastic. But you can also see the care that they spend on these, and they want to use them, Again, we teach them, we say to them, you need a folder or something, you need to keep them safe at home. You need to be using these throughout year 10 for your mocks and your assessments, so look after them. And yes, we do have the odd few that lose them, but once they realise that has a negative impact on their revision in year 10, they then go away and redo them. So hopefully that's going to have the positive impact there. So you can see quite a few examples there. And for anyone interested, I've got the placemats for medicine, for American West, and for Elizabeth. It's part of my gain time this year to create them for American West. Sorry, not American West, for Germany. As I say, happy to share. I'm not really on Twitter anymore, but you can get in touch with me via LinkedIn. And I do often put some of these things free on TES as well, if people want to get them there. So I speak to my students a lot. As I say, I've got very positive feedback from parents as well. We can see here, and I'll just kind of leave it on the slide for you because I can, as Emily's popped up, I know I'm running out of time. And the feedback that comes from the students, and I think this really kind of shows the confidence that they feel and the safety. I think these placemats provide kind of a safety net for them. If I'm doing all of this, then I will do well. But just really quickly, in a couple of minutes, what I've then done, and some of this is stolen from Greg Thornton. I think it's probably the second time he's been mentioned this evening, but he's done some great slides on helping students to revise for GCSE. And what I've done is then taken those placemats and supported students in how they can use the flashcards in year 11 to revise as well. So just as a bit of a summary there, think about how you can build in a consistent revision method from year 7, plan revision lessons into your curriculum from year 7, actually teach the steps of revision and show the students through the placemats or through whatever technique you decide that by doing this, they will be successful. And then you'll save time, I believe, at Key Stage 4. Students will then have that confidence, that knowledge, that safety net of how to revise. So hopefully, I really hope that has been useful for people. And as I say, more than happy to share any resources.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think it's so important that we actually teach them how to revise. It's that thing, isn't it? We tell them to do things, but if we haven't told them how to do it, then they're not going to know. We've gone down the look, cover, quiz, check with the use of knowledge organisers. So we're doing that at Key Stage 3, and I'm hoping in the next couple of years we'll see that coming through into year 10 without all of the nagging that we've had to do thus far. But thank you so much for sharing that approach. I think it's so good to see how it has been embedded and the absolutely cracking examples that you've done as well. So thank you so much. So this next part is going to be something slightly different. So we are going to have a panel session now, and we have got what we thought about this would be really useful, and we think it'll be really useful for everyone, but we thought we'd give a little panel session focused a little bit more on early career teachers and potentially trainee teachers as well, because I think at this point in your career, you kind of go, what do I do with this time? Like, or I've got a job in September, or I'm going into ECT2, and, you know, I've only been here a year, and what should I do? And to be fair, some of us who've been teaching a while maybe feel that as well, especially if we've started a new job or we are starting a new job. So what we're going to look at in this next bit is we've got a beautiful panel session that we've put together, and we're so grateful for people for giving up their time. We have got Sarah Perkins, so it's the other half of Mr. Ross Perkins, they are obviously juggling their childcare this evening, so thank you so much for that. Sarah is going to take on the school-based mentor aspect, so somebody who supports trainees and ECTs within school, and the kind of from that perspective. We've also got Victoria Crooks as well from the University of Nottingham, and she has stepped out of another meeting to come and join us, so we are so pathetically grateful, Victoria, for coming and joining us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and obviously she's going to take it from a PGCE university-based mentor. And then we have Faye Fitzsimmons, which some of you may remember from our history event in September. Was it, Faye?
Yeah, September.
I can't quite work out which ones are happening anymore. But so Faye's going to give us the perspective of essentially an ECT, and kind of use her very recent experience for those of us who are a little bit further down the teaching line than Faye is. So we're going to run through some questions. If you have any questions in the chat, then please do pop them in the chat or on socials. Claire is monitoring those, so if you have any other questions. But let's get started with a bit of an opening question here. So what do you think are the most important things that trainees and ECT should focus on during the summer term to set themselves up well for September? Faye, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, so I would say whether you're starting a new school or like you might be an ECT and maybe you're progressing in terms of you're going from teaching year 10 to then going into teaching year 11 and so on. I would just say looking at the content of what your school might be teaching. If it's a new school that you go into, just revising their curriculum, because there's so much history and it can be such a broad topic that you're looking at, but they might focus on a really niche part of it. And then, like I was mentioning, in terms of if it's exams, just revising that specification, like what is it, what's that unit of work that they do. So that's my advice that I would say in terms of subject knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I've had a trainee this year, and that's something I've been like, you know, when you're heading towards your first job, really think about the GCSE specification. Would you agree with that, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely. I think getting hold of the curriculum is really important. If you're working in a new school in September, getting in touch, getting hold of the curriculum, it should, in most departments, I would hope, be centrally planned. But if not, you know, people have mentioned putting resources on TES. There's resources on X as well. But yeah, I think something I would add, sort of separate to curriculum, is I think that this time is a really good opportunity for trainees, ECTs, to reflect about what kind of teacher they want to be as well, especially trainees, and think about what can I kind of steal from other people. So using some time in the summer term, gain time perhaps, to observe colleagues or observe other teachers perhaps in your new school, and see how they manage their classrooms, and consider what might I use here when I set up these new classes in September. What expectations might I like to have in my room? How might I start those very first lessons? I think that would be really important too.
Perfect. And I think routines can be so important as well. Like, actually, what am I going to look at? Because we've all heard those things, haven't we? That don't smile until Christmas, or go in hard, or whatever it is. But I think it's nice to know, like, and I think it's something that actually you continue to build on as you go through your career. You kind of work out what those best first lessons are, because we've all had ones where we've gone in and absolutely died on our bottoms, I'm sure. Victoria, what would you say is the thing that they should focus on in this summer term?
I think all of that is really great advice. And my one really was about just expanding your horizons a little bit. You will have got into some routines. You will have found a way that works for you in the classroom. But actually, this is a really good moment if you've got a spare lesson on your timetable, because perhaps you're an ECT who's been teaching year 11 and they've now gone. Can you, as Sarah said, go and use that to do some observation of other colleagues? But do that really deliberately to just reconsider what you've come to think of as good practice, and to reflect and to evaluate and say, well, you know, am I really doing the best thing in terms of teaching history? Perhaps go and spend some time with the SENDco and the SEND base and think about what it looks like to approach history in adaptive teaching terms to support those young people. Think a bit more creatively about your pedagogies as well. And are there things that you were a bit frightened to try out at the beginning of the year, which actually now you could go and take a bit of a risk with, some slightly risky approaches, and just have a bit of a go and just expand those horizons?
I think that's really interesting. I think that's something that actually we could all do, like use that gain time, because I'm sure we all, whenever we do see another colleague teach, we all go, oh yeah, no, and it kind of reinvigorates any teacher. So I think actually that was a brilliant example of things that actually an experienced teacher could go away and do. Faye, I'm going to add this one towards you. Looking back, what do you wish you'd spent more time doing in the summer term before your first September, as it were?
Very similar to what Sarah and Victoria were talking about. I think I know that I felt extremely overwhelmed with not only having to deal with your day-to-day life of teaching the curriculum, but also like the systems that work within your school, like looking at the behaviour routines, things like that, and how the behaviour system works. But then again, trying to figure out what type of teacher is that you want to be, and setting them expectations and setting kind of the standards of what you expect and what the kids expect off of you, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that, like, I remember, like, I think it was maybe like during my PGCE, I still have it because I know where all my PGCE notes are of them saying, what kind of teacher do you want to be? And it was all having to make mind maps of like the kind of teacher we wanted to be. And sometimes I come across it like in my garage when I'm cleaning my kids' stuff out, and I'm like, oh, how close am I to that teacher and things? And I think it's a really interesting thing to really think about, because it is a persona, isn't it? And I think that's something that I think people often don't realize, that teaching is a performative profession. We put on a persona, and we go and we perform 5-6 times a day. So actually getting yourself in the headspace for that is really important. So I know, Sarah, you kind of mentioned this already, but is there any other like practical advice that you would give to trainees or ECTs about making the most of their time? So I know you said maybe about going off and seeing them. Are there any other small actions that you think they could do now that would have a big impact in September?
I mean, there's so much paperwork, which can be really overwhelming. I need to get seating plans ready if you've got your classes. I need to do send data. I need to print this. I think for me, entering into what will be my 10th year of teaching, I've learned that the priority is, while you're in school in that summer, whether it be the school you're going to teach in or whether you can go and visit that school, it's getting that curriculum, it's getting those first few lessons for each of the year groups. Perhaps if you're in that school already, getting some of that printing done, so that when you come in on those training days, when you come back, which you'll hopefully get 1 or 2 of, then you can do things like seating plans when you've got your class lists. Then you can go through and add your send data in. But I think getting that printing and getting those first couple lessons solid in your head, you know where you're going with it. That's just one practical task. You don't want to be going in over the holidays and doing printing. Over the holidays, you can perhaps do a little bit more reading around that curriculum. But doing that before the summer break, I think, would be the priority. It has been certainly for me in the last few years.
That's really good advice there. And I think because it is something, if you know that you've got those, I know that like even going back after a half term, if I've got that first week's lesson sorted, I can like transition back in much easier as like everybody else in the household gets used to those routines and things again. So that's a really good one. So Victoria, I know we said like, how can trainees make the best use of their academic and curriculum knowledge? If we think about specifically, how can they do this if they don't know what school or year group that they're going to be teaching in at this point?
So I think we like to think about our subject knowledge in very specific terms, particular topics. I need to master this moment in history and know everything about it, but actually that really bigger picture thinking, that broad sweep of chronology, understanding the wider perspective of the curriculum. So if you do know which school you're going to be teaching in, getting hold of that curriculum map, not going away and planning, 5 weeks ahead of individual lessons and exactly what's going to happen. You don't know the children that you're going to be working with, so you need to wait to do that. Absolutely make sure you've got what you need for the first week so you can hit the ground running. But the time would be better spent, I think, looking at that curriculum map, looking for where the connections can be made between different topics, where there are substantive concepts that carry through from one period to another, that if you are to emphasise them when you're teaching, would really help to lay really good groundwork for children's understanding, their world building for later on. So I've seen beginning teachers teach fabulous lessons where they really understand what the GCSE and A-level in that school looks like. And so when they're teaching year 7, they can say things like, oh, well, you will need to understand what communism means. Let's really unpick that, because when you get to A-level, and they might make that explicit to the children or they know it implicitly, but it's that real understanding of how does this all fit together? Where do I need to put the emphasis? Where is my understanding going to best be spent developing? Where is the place where I really need to focus? And it's that sense of how do all these things fit together? And if you don't know where you're going, you still will have a general sense of what the shape of the curriculum is probably going to look like. And then it's a case of that will then free you up to go and fill in the specifics when you get to where you're going to be.
I think that's really interesting, because obviously Sarah's gone very much for look at the micro, so that actually you've got those practical things, and you've gone at the same time zoom right out, so that you've got that big understanding of that journey and where it's going. And I think that can be so important, because I think sometimes, especially when you start a new school, you end up feeling a little bit aimless because you're like, oh, I'm not quite sure where that has gone. And I think even because it's so difficult in history with all of the disciplinary concepts, like even focusing in on one of those would perhaps be useful, and going away and saying, actually, I'm going to go away and read the HA stuff on similarity and difference, so that I know how best to teach that, or the different ways that significance is taught, so that when that comes up in those 3 units across Key Stage 3, we can pull that together. So I think that's really, really interesting.
And a quick plug for, there's a beginning teacher section on the HA website, which actually really breaks that down. And if you've come through a training route where perhaps the subject specific has not been a key part of the training program, I would really recommend that as a place to go to top you up. Yeah.
Absolutely. What's the wisdom on sections I find are really useful as well, especially if you need just a bit of a reminder, and also for those beginning teachers as well. I think so. Let's think about some more specifics then. Are there specific routines, habits, or resources that you'd recommend they explore now? So I know we've name dropped the HA a couple of times. If you might use your experience here, so if there's something practical that's worked for you or your mentees in the past, but something that is going to reduce stress. I mean, I would absolutely say get some rest before September as well. Like, come in with your well-being high. But if we were thinking about things that are going to help reduce that stress over workload and things, what has maybe worked well for you in the past or for your mentees? This one's for all of us. So let's go to Victoria first. I'll stop picking on Faye first.
So I think I would say 2 things. I think find a way to develop your subject knowledge, which you enjoy. Most history teachers become history teachers because we do love our subject. So a podcast in the car as you're driving to work or on the bus, that's a really low level way of just topping up your subject knowledge, but hopefully tapping in to something that you love, that will keep you inspired and keep you keen for doing the job, and give you those little nuggets of knowledge that just really grab children and make them interested in the subject. And then my other point is a more pragmatic one, which is buy a slow cooker, because quite genuinely you need to be able to thrive during this year, not just survive. And a key part of that is sleeping, is resting, but it's also eating well. And so find a way to maintain a healthy diet and a good routine. And get that in place before you go into the job, because when the pressure builds, they're the first things that slip, really.
Oh yeah, no, tell me about it. I've had a very busy week this week, and every day I've gone, I don't know what me and my children are eating today. And so it's been a lot of freezer tapas this week, I must say. So who wants to jump in now?
I'm happy to contribute. It's a hard learning curve. I honestly don't think that my balance was kind of fully established until I had children, and I had no choice but to finish the working day at a certain point and go home and deal with my other responsibilities. I do think, as we've all said, using the resources available is really important. Most good departments should have centrally planned resources, in my opinion. If they don't, though, think about all the colleagues who've shared amazing resources today and signposted amazing resources that they can provide. Don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel and, you know, do these amazing shining PowerPoints. Use what is there. That will save time hugely. I think it's really important. You know, those resources have been created by people who are really, really excellent at what they do. There's no need to kind of replan it for the sake of replanning it. So I think that helps with workload massively. I mean, all our department resources are centrally planned by Ross, which is very helpful. But it saved masses of time. It's just amazing. It's, you know, that's how it should be. So I would definitely say, yeah, use the resources available.
And I think that kind of leads into what I was going to say next, which is about actually what misconceptions do we see or common mistakes do we make? And I think that going away and making lots of shiny resources, it can be really tempting because it's almost like that when you make a lovely revision plan, you feel like you've done some revision. But actually, I think one of the things that I've said to one of my trainee this year was the planning isn't the making. The planning is what questions are you going to ask at this point? What is the purpose of this particular activity? Like, who are you going to target for that bit? Do you need that for this class? Does it need to change for another class? So actually taking a resource that's already there and adapting it, and actually even just annotating it to know what you're going to ask and when you're going to ask it, so that you really understand the purpose of it, I would say is far more effective in terms of time than actually making lots of things from scratch. Particularly, and I know most teachers are very generous, but history teachers, we are weirdly generous with everything that we do and with all our enthusiasm. So there are so many people out there who are so willing to share their time, their expertise, and their resources. So I think that's one of the key things in terms of like misconceptions or what you can do. Is there anything else that we think that is a mistake or a misconception that we could address for people here? So don't waste your time doing this. Have you got any, Faye? Did you make any big mistakes?
I think maybe just for me personally, I felt that I needed to be like perfect, like the moment that I got in September. And it's always been a character of mine to try and be perfect in a way. And obviously teaching, you can't be perfect every single day. And I think realizing that you don't have to get everything done all at once. Like, you need to prioritize, and particularly over the summer, like, you won't know the full picture until you're in there. You know your classes, and you know what classes work well with certain types of pedagogical practices and things like that. So until you're actually in the moment, that's when you start to realize, and you kind of come to shape yourself as a teacher as well.
Yeah, so kind of relax a little bit as well. Like, just
Yes.
don't worry about being perfect. Don't worry about planning everything from scratch. Anything else to add there?
I would agree with both of those things. They were the things that I put down, really. Don't plan the whole of your first half term. You know, I remember feeling a huge pressure to do that. And then when I got into the context and met the children, actually they needed something really quite different from my adaptation of the resources. And so get a little bit ahead, but go in with a really open mind and open eyes to understanding your context and planning for that. Don't go out and buy lots of fancy equipment and fancy accessories for your classroom. It's not about that. It's about you and about what you're bringing to that classroom, your relationship that you'll build with the children, your historical knowledge, the way that you ask questions and try and understand their learning needs and respond to them. And don't go in thinking that you are now the finished product, as Faye was saying. You don't have to be perfect, because you're not the finished product. You know, 25 odd years in, I am not a finished product, and I'm still having to learn. So go in with that really open mind of, yeah, this is a learning experience, and I will learn more and more every single year of my career. I don't have to be the finished product right now.
That's amazing. Anything to add there, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of ties in with like the buying the accessories, but we've all been there where we've gone and decorated our classrooms. I remember creating a volcano on the wall when I was teaching a bit of geography with all the labels. And, you know, it's great to have a tidy, well-presented room. I think that's really important, but you don't need to have these immaculate show-stopping displays all over the place. I think, you know, prioritising, as we said, the curriculum, as Victoria said, listening to podcasts perhaps over the summer, doing a bit more of your reading around over the summer as well. You don't need to do that all in the summer term. Use the resources you've got in front of you, other teachers, your curriculum online. Don't decorate your classroom loads and do loads of academic reading at that point.
Perfect. So let us close then. If you could give just one sentence of advice to a trainee or an ECT right now about September and that your preparations for it, what would that be? Who wants to go for this one?
I'll go first if you want.
Well,
so mine is prioritise and be realistic. We can never do it all as teachers.
Oh, I love that. Faye?
Mine is similar to what I said before. Don't try to be a perfectionist.
Lovely. And Victoria?
Mine is a bit longer. Get connected to the national history teaching community. So much of the ECF is very generic in nature, and it's quite difficult sometimes to keep a hold of the history. So build yourself a network that's focused on history, perhaps look into the HA and joining that, SHP, engage with events like this, make connections with your local university or your local museums, get involved in history so you can keep the thing that got you into teaching in the first place at the centre.
That's amazing, and very, very on brand for the university element to go over the one sentence. But thank you so much. I am so appreciative of your time this evening, and thank you so much to our panelists and to everybody else who has attended today. What we will do is we will share all of the PowerPoints from our speakers, and we'll also share some top tips from this panel session as well. But thank you so much, Faye, Sarah and Victoria. We really appreciate your time. So the only thing that it remains for me to do is just to say a big thank you to you all who have come and watched live this evening, and those of you who are also watching this recording at a later date. Hopefully you will find this really useful. I have made so many notes in amongst doing the hosting side of this. All of our speakers, all of our panelists are very happy to be contacted via their social media handles, etc. So if you want to know any more, then please do get in touch. So just thank you so much. Please get involved in the Padlet, get involved online, share these things, and let's continue building that network that we've just talked about.